So we're in Joe's office at Cheap Joe's, August 10th, I would say,
That's right.
2016, with Alexis Lavine. And here you are in Boone, North Carolina.
One of my favorite places.
One of your favorite places. It's been a rainy week.
It has. A good week to be in the studio.
But a good week to be in the studio. So you didn't have to travel too far to get here, did you?
No, I live in Greensboro, and so my trip is literally 2 hours door to door.
So you could almost go home at night.
Almost, but I don't want to.
So your class is a combination class. Could you explain kind of what that means? I mean, you do oil, watercolor, and...
Well, I personally am just a watercolor painter.
Okay.
And all of my demos are using watercolor. However, the subject is so universal and
Okay.
applies to all artists, no matter what they're using to paint with. So I invited all artists to attend a workshop. And so we have 3 oil painters and 1 acrylic painter,
Okay.
as well as the rest of the class. Most of the class is composed of watercolor painters, but it's very interesting to have the painters in the class using other mediums, because
Okay.
we have very interesting discussions about different ways to approach a subject. But the overriding subject, or theme, if you will, for the week is learning to design better paintings.
Okay.
And that, of course, is something that we all need to do.
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago I was talking to Frank Webb, and Frank was telling me that a lot of people want to put the paint on the paper, and Frank is kind of a, let's do the composition first, let's get the design down, and then we can think about putting the paint on the paper. So that's an interesting approach to have acrylic people, oil people, and watercolor people learning the same thing, which is pretty much universal, right?
Absolutely.
So one of the questions I always ask is, and I've learned this from talking to many instructors, you come in with a lot of responsibility to your students, whether there's 10 or 25 or whatever. What do you want them to leave with at the end of the week? What do you want to impart to them? What's your goal for the week here at Cheap Joe's for your people?
I always spend a great deal of time and thought preparing for a workshop. In the case of this workshop, as I said, the focus is on designing better paintings.
Okay.
So my goal, certainly for the watercolor painters in the group, is not to necessarily make them better watercolor painters. Even though watercolor painters get very focused on technique.
Right.
Because it is so, I think it's much harder to use watercolor, and they get very focused on technique. But if I can help them and the others to learn how to design better paintings, meaning to learn how to better put the pieces of their paintings together in
Right.
terms of the shapes and the values and the colors, so that their paintings become more readable and more expressive and more eye-catching.
Okay.
I'll be real happy if they go home at the end of the week with some of those ideas that they can use to carry forward.
Okay. As a painter yourself, when you start a painting, what is your goal? What are you trying to say by painting? I mean, you paint numerous subjects.
I do.
Your website was very informative in terms of you've got lots of different subject matter. So, and I asked that question because when I was talking to Linda Baker, and you probably know Linda,
I do.
Linda tells stories with her painting. She finds something that is interesting and she tries to, whereas Frank comes at it from a purely compositional kind of point of view. And how do you approach your subject matter?
For many years, my paintings concentrated on landscape.
Okay.
And when I did that, I was more interested in capturing a moment, a place, and an expression of weather, but I wasn't so interested in storytelling. My paintings in recent years have migrated. I've actually really changed my focus. I still paint landscapes, but the work that I consider to be my most serious work revolves around the figure.
Right.
And I feel that storytelling is indeed a very important part of my figurative paintings. And one thing that makes it interesting to me, it might seem contradictory to some people, but it works for me, is I shoot a lot of photographs outside, on the street, wherever I am, and I'm photographing people who I don't know.
Okay.
Just random people that I see who have an interesting gesture or a beautiful light on them, but I don't know them. And so then I start to design a painting of a stranger.
Right.
And what that forces me to do is to make up the stories. So
Right.
in my mind, I'm imagining, who is this person? What is this person doing? What do I want to express to my viewer about how I feel
Right.
about this person?
So you're creating a mood,
I'm creating a mood and a person and a life.
and your colors would indicate a mood. Like, we have a painting right here of a guy, and so
that guy.
the mood, I mean, that's off your website.
Mhm.
And what was the mood here that you were trying to capture?
The story of that painting actually was, I was at an outdoor jazz festival down on St. Croix in the Virgin Islands.
Okay.
And I saw that man in the crowd, and he had this fabulous, gigantic white beard and a long white ponytail. Brilliant. It was exceptional. And I have a camera with a 24x zoom lens on it.
Okay.
So I don't have to get too close to people, which is very good, because I try to not end up in a confrontational
Right, right,
situation.
right.
So I kind of followed this guy around the festival for a while, though, and just shot as many pictures of him as I could. And what I was trying to do most was to get him with the sun behind him, because when the sun was behind him, backlighting him, coming through his hair and his beard,
Right,
it
right.
was just spectacular. And when I got back to the studio with my photographs, the photograph I used for this painting actually showed his entire body all the way down to his feet, and the guy he was talking to, and I don't know, 25 people in the background, because it was a busy festival. But all I was interested in was his face, which was very interesting, and this wonderful backlit hair. And so that's what happened. I mean, that's what led up to that painting. And using transparent watercolor was just perfect for
Right,
expressing the
right.
whiteness of his beard. There's no white paint in that.
Right.
And I particularly enjoyed in this letting his white beard and his ponytail just sort of melt off
Right.
into the unpainted white paper.
So you're painting on dry paper or wet paper? Are
Oh,
you-
sometimes either way.
Okay,
Yeah,
you can
yeah.
go
I
both
use a
ways.
variety of techniques.
So then we have the landscape, and that's you can go to her website and find examples of that. Very interesting colors. I mean, that's why they're prominent on your website, because these are fantastic paintings.
Thank you.
How did you choose those colors, and what kind of mood were you trying to create?
That painting is also inspired by a place down in St. Croix.
Okay.
And it's a very odd kind of a tree called a Strangler Fig.
Okay.
Not necessarily the nicest tree, as you can tell by the name. But I was fascinated by all of the viney-looking shapes and the air roots hanging down.
Uh-huh.
The tree itself, just the structure of the tree, was just fascinating to me.
Okay.
And what I decided to do in this particular painting, the light was coming from my left
Right.
as I was looking at the tree. So the left side of the tree has more light on it, the right has more shadow on it. And the painting was actually done with the two sides of it using two very different techniques.
Right.
So if you notice, the left side of the tree is mostly light with a darker background behind it. And that was painted largely using a technique that we watercolor painters call negative painting.
Okay.
The right side of the tree was painted positively, where the tree and the vines are dark against a light background. And then towards the center of the painting, I had to meld the two sides together so it wouldn't look like the painting was, just fractured in half.
Right.
So I had to blend and transition and move back and forth through it in the middle. So it was a very interesting process making the painting. The actual tree was very, very gray. In fact, the photograph that I used, because I painted this here, not in St. Croix, the photograph was very gray. And so in this case, I just pumped up all the colors and added in as many colors as I could in the background spaces and also within the grays themselves. I do not use gray paint.
Right.
So instead of using gray paint, I'll use other colors and mix them or place them side by side. And so they create the illusion of gray, but it's much more luminous than just using a flat gray paint.
So if you were going to describe your art to someone who didn't know you, how would you describe your art?
In terms of a label for it?
Right. I mean, representational watercolor.
Okay.
I mean,
okay.
I'm just searching here to kind of, if someone's watching this video to get to know you and to get to know some artistic kinds of terms and, already I'm interested. I mean, one of the questions could be, why would I want to take a watercolor class from Alexis Lavine? And that could be a question too. So we're getting to know each other, and it seems realistic.
Yes, my work is mostly based in realism.
Right.
Every now and then I do paint an abstract painting, and I find that surprisingly and delightfully fascinating and challenging. But 98% of my work, shall we say, is based in realism. And I'm a transparent watercolorist, meaning that I do not use white paint or gouache or mixed media. I just use watercolor, transparent watercolor, usually on paper. I actually do own a tube of white watercolor, and every now and then, for instance, if I'm painting, I recently painted snowy landscape, and I wanted to, at the very end, give the illusion that there was some snow blowing through the air. And so I got out my white gouache, my white watercolor, and spattered a bit on. So every now and then, I make a painting that is not specifically or 100% transparent, but for the most part, I'm a transparent painter. I think of my work as having a contemporary feel.
Okay, I'd say that.
And design, to get back to this week, design is a huge, important part of my work. So I don't just take my subject as it is presented to me and paint precisely what I see. I like to take my subject and alter it, move pieces around, eliminate big pieces. I love to crop sections out of my subject. I find that with many subjects, including people, cropping portions out can make the remaining shapes far more interesting. It can create some mystery and some ambiguity, which I love. And in spite of the fact that I said to you a few minutes ago that I'm a storyteller, I frequently like to tell only part of the story. Because I think that can engage my viewer more.
Well, it's like the picture of the guy there at the festival. I can see that hanging in my living room, and every time you go by it, you see something different. And speaking of that painting, I've talked to a lot of artists, and some spend months on paintings. Some, like a Janet Rogers, or they get in and get out real quick, and it's representational, but it's very loose. You seem to kind of be in between. I mean, you're very representational, but yet it looks loose. So, like with the guy painting, how long would that have taken you to...
That painting probably took me several days to
Okay.
make. When my paintings of landscapes, still lifes, flowers, they go much faster.
Right, okay.
When I paint plein air, and I do paint plein air in the summertime, almost every week I'm out at least once a week painting plein air. Those paintings are very quick because they have to be, because of the changing light
Right,
and changing
right.
weather. And in fact, for many, many years, my focus was plein air painting, which is a great discipline. I'm going off subject here, I'm sorry.
Right, that's fine.
But the plein air painting is a great discipline because it teaches you to make up your mind and get in there quickly and be assertive. And so it's a great discipline. And those paintings might only take an hour and a half.
Right.
When I'm painting my recent figurative paintings, they'll take me days,
Okay.
sometimes a day or 2 days just to draw them. Before I ever pick up a paintbrush, I might spend 2 days just drawing. I do my drawing freehand, and I'll start drawing and I'll revise and
Okay.
revise, because for me, expressing the anatomy and the gesture
Right.
is very, very important, and I want to get it right before I start to paint. And so the drawing itself can take a couple of days, and then the painting can take days more. And sometimes particularly with the figurative paintings, I'll work on it for a few days or a week. I put it aside for a week or two, come back to it with a fresh eye, work on it some more, put it aside for a month, come back to it. It's a very interesting process.
Would I be correct in saying that you've been painting for about 20 years? Is that...
Maybe a few more than that.
Maybe a few more than that? Okay.
But a long time.
Okay. So how did you how did you become an artist? I mean, what led you to that pursuit?
I always enjoyed art, even as a child. And I always, when I had the opportunity to take an art class, or in school, or privately, I took art classes. When I got to college, I thought about studying art, but I decided that I needed to do something more practical.
Right.
And I actually got a bachelor's degree in microbiology.
Huh?
By the time I earned my degree, however, I knew that I did not want to be a microbiologist,
Right.
and I really wanted to do something artistic. So I looked around for something else that I could do, and I discovered that there was a profession called medical illustration.
Okay.
And that seemed perfect to me because I could combine my scientific background with my love of art.
Okay.
And so I went back to school and I got a master's degree in medical illustration, which is actually a fascinating field.
Wow.
And then it's a really long story, which is not worth going into, but it was a combination of family and geography, and I was a medical illustrator for a few years, but then I found myself living in the mountains in Maryland,
Okay.
which are very much like the mountains here in North Carolina, although maybe not as nice.
Is that Cumberland, Maryland?
Yes,
Yes,
Cumberland,
I've been
Maryland,
there.
yes. I think the mountains in North Carolina are actually a bit more dramatic. And in fact, Cumberland, Maryland is not unlike Boone,
Yeah. Right.
small town.
Small town.
And
A lot of history.
back in those days, which was more than 20 years ago, we didn't have fax machines and email and all that. So living in a relatively isolated place like that, it was very difficult to be a medical illustrator.
Okay.
But it was a great place to be a landscape painter.
Right.
And so I put aside the medical illustration and got out my watercolors. And the rest, as they say, is history.
And then what led you to teach at that point, after
Oh.
you've been doing art? And so you're still an artist, first and foremost, but you're also an instructor.
Yes, yes, I am an artist first and foremost. That is who I am and what I do. But you know what? I think that teaching is one of the most important things I do. I just think it is so important and necessary for me to give back. I've had some really good teachers along the way. And in fact, you've already mentioned two of them, Linda Baker and Frank Webb. Frank Webb was one of the very first watercolor teachers I ever had. In Cumberland, Maryland, in fact.
Really? Frank in Cumberland?
Came to Cumberland to teach a workshop many years ago.
He's very philosophical too. I really enjoy talking to him.
I just love his, just listening to him talk is just wonderful. What led me to teaching? Wow, that's a really hard question. I started teaching quite a long time ago. When I lived in Cumberland, in fact, and I think I started teaching, and the first thing I taught was watercolor, and I think that I started teaching watercolor because nobody else was doing it. And I just looked around and I thought, boy, you know, there's a lot of people around here who might want to learn to watercolor, who might need to learn to paint with watercolor, and let's see if I can do it. Let's give it a try. And I discovered that that I could do it. Not everybody can. I hope this doesn't sound wrong. Not all painters can teach.
Right.
It requires certain verbal skills and ways to move a brush and talk at the same time, and I found that I was able to do it, and that I enjoyed it, and I just loved sharing with other people, and teaching has been just a huge important part of my life since then. I'm very grateful that people are willing to come to me. I'm so grateful.
Well, you broached a common theme that I've heard over and over again, and that is the desire to give back. So you've gotten stuff, you've gotten techniques and design, and this is how you do it, and all of a sudden it takes on its own life, kind of, and you want to share that with your people, and you know, that's kind of like why Joe started Cheap Joe's, I guess, is to share his love of watercolor and to make it easy for people to get supplies, which 30 years ago when he started, it wasn't easy to find good supplies. So, and that's an interesting. So, who have been your influences in art? You mentioned Linda and Frank, and any others that of note that.
I've studied with a good number of people. When I lived in Cumberland back in the late 80s and early 90s, I was actually, I started my own little business running art workshops.
Okay.
Did it for a few years. It was called Haystack Mountain Workshops because the mountain I lived on was called Haystack Mountain. And I actually managed to bring some pretty famous artists to Little Cumberland, Maryland to teach workshops. That's when I studied with Frank Webb. He very graciously came. And so I'm trying to remember some of the artists. Frank does really stand out because he's just so amazing.
And he doesn't think of himself as being an influence. I mean, that was the amazing thing with Dr. Frank. I mean, you've influenced people, obviously. Your technique, your color scheme, I mean, there are probably people out there that want to be Alexis. Or, you know, people want to be Frank Webb, or they want to be Janet Rogers, or, you know.
Although I never encourage my students. I don't want them to be me. I want them to be themselves.
Right.
I don't want them to paint like me. I want them to paint like themselves. I certainly want to give them lots of information and lots of inspiration, but I don't want to send a whole lot of little clones out. I don't think any teacher should do that. Can I mention one thing though about when I was doing my workshops
Right.
and things in Cumberland? That's when I met Joe the first time.
Really?
Joe came to Cumberland to present his Van Gogh program.
Okay.
And it was probably in the early 90s, I don't remember specifically when, but that's when I met Joe. And it was just so fabulous
Yeah.
meeting him and hosting him and having him in our little city to present his program. So Joe and I go back
It's a fantastic program.
It
and
is.
I think we have it on tape here that you can rent the tape out.
It is. It's
Yeah.
absolutely fantastic, and there's rarely a dry eye in the audience when he makes that.
And it's a little
presentation.
different every time you see it. I've seen it 3 or 4 times.
Mhm.
And, so if you could be any artist in history, who would you have wanted to be? Have you ever thought about that?
No, I've never thought of that. Now, there are certain artists in history who I admire
Okay.
tremendously. For instance, being a watercolor painter, I'm drawn more to those, to some of the watercolor painters. So I am very enamored of the work of Andrew Wyeth
Okay.
and his son Jamie Wyeth.
Jamie?
Oh
yeah.
my gosh, Jamie is a bit of a wild man, but I love his work. Edward Hopper, Andrew Wyeth,
Right.
John Singer Sargent,
Right.
Edgar Degas,
Yeah.
very, very interesting.
He did the ballerinas, right? Yeah.
Ballerinas and racehorses, and I've read quite a lot about him. And from what I know about him, he was not a very nice man, but he was an amazing designer. He wasn't a
Yeah.
watercolor painter, but he was an amazing designer. And so I put aside what I've read about his personal views of certain people and just admire the designs of
Yeah.
his paintings tremendously. He was incredible. And I think that many of the designs of his paintings are tremendously contemporary.
Right.
You know, they look like they could be done today.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about that, I remember looking at some of his stuff in the Metropolitan or Museum of Modern Art. I don't know which, where, you know, and you see it up close and personal, and it's very pastel-y, but the design element is very, there's not anything out of place.